This presentation is meant for teacher candidates enrolled in Illinois State University's TCH 208 and 209, and it constitutes an introduction to academic language and how to integrate academic language into your lesson plans. So what is academic language? In a nutshell, it refers to oral and written language used for academic purposes rather than everyday and social communication. So, the language that kids use on the playground or when a kid is asking someone to pass them a pencil or get up and use the restroom is very different from academic language, such as asking a student to speak from the perspective of a particular character or to make predictions about a text based on specific events or details in a text, or to summarize a text. So it also refers to the means by which students develop and express content area understandings, as well as the language of specific disciplines. So the language of history and the language that scientists use is very different from the language of literary analysis or the language of math. And students need to know the language of these specific disciplines in order to learn and use them and engage in meaningful ways in those content areas. So another way of thinking about academic language is that it's very closely related to disciplinary literacy. So let's talk about different academic language components. Academic language components include language functions, language demands, and language supports. So language functions refers to the content and language focus of a learning activity, and it's represented by active verbs within your lesson purpose, within your lesson plan. So common examples in literacy include identifying main ideas and details, summarizing, analyzing and interpreting characters, predicting, evaluating or interpreting an author's purpose, etc. Language demands is basically what students need to know with respect to vocabulary, discourse, and syntax, which I'll talk about in a minute, in order to engage in the language functions that you've identified in your lesson's purpose. Language supports are the things that you do or the things that you provide. So they are teacher actions and materials that are within your lesson and in the procedures of your lesson plan that are going to help your students meet the specific language demands so that they can carry out the functions within the lesson. Examples include modeling, frames, repetition of key vocabulary and terms, visuals, and other multimodal materials, as well as culturally relevant high-quality texts. So let's talk a little bit about the three academic language demands. Um, there may be more than this. So typically we think of vocabulary, discourse, and syntax. These are the ones that you're going to be expected to include or reference when you have to complete your EdTPA process in student teaching. I actually think that there's another one that ought to be in here, and that is phonics or graphophonemics, particularly when working with very young kids. So do keep in mind that that could be another one that you add in there, but EdTPA does not prompt you to consider those. So let's begin by talking about vocabulary. Vocabulary refers to words and phrases within the disciplines, as well as terms within contents that have that content area specific meanings that differ from meanings used in everyday life. So for example, the word table is something that you may have in your kitchen or in a classroom, but it's also a very specific text structure in disciplines like math and science. Other examples will include general academic vocabulary, such as compare, analyze, evaluate, predict, um, as well as academic discipline specific words and phrases. So, for example, in legal and historical contexts, you might find the phrase in contempt of court. And in science, you'll find the word hypothesis. Discourse is perhaps um, the language demand that is most difficult to identify or define. And it's one that many teacher candidates find themselves to be fuzziest about when it comes to integrating them into lesson plans. It refers to distinctive features or ways of structuring language that provide useful ways for content to be communicated. So, in literacy, there are different structures for composing, interpreting, and comprehending different kinds of texts, like expository texts, narrative texts, poems, etc. So one example might be in narrative text, we have different structures. You might have a general structure such as characters, setting, action, resolution, that sort of thing. But you may also have circular structures where what happens in a narrative is that over the course of the narrative, you come right back to the beginning. There are also different structures of poems, Diamante, etc. Um, and then in expository texts, such as an opinion piece or persuasive writing, you might begin with an introductory paragraph and then articulate different claims with specific examples. Um, so, if a language function in your lesson is to interpret character development, then appropriate language forms could include written essays, citing textual evidence, um, and pattern sentences. So, for example, the author used dialogue to introduce the main character of a text. Um, so, a very, very common way of supporting discourse um, is sentence frames and also modeling. Syntax is a little bit simpler. So, syntax refers to a set of conventions for organizing symbols, words, and phrases together into different kinds of structures, such as sentences or equations. So, this really, in many ways, refers to grammar. So, this may include sequencing words, such as first, then, subsequently, finally, or conjunctions like and, but. In math, it might include certain kinds of symbols, such as the equals or other symbols for square roots, multiplication, what have you, or subscript and superscript. And it can also include punctuation. Syntax also includes word morphology, so word roots and affixes. We'll look at some additional examples of vocabulary, discourse, and syntax when we go over specific lessons. So in the remainder of this presentation, we're going to walk through two different lesson plans. First, we'll walk through a lesson plan titled Stepping into a Character's Shoes in Out of the Dust, Journaling Using Sensory Imagery, which is a lesson plan designed for a fourth grade bilingual student. And then we'll also examine a lesson plan that is designed for a whole class on identifying irony in the book, The Big Box. And this is designed for fifth grade. In stepping into a character's shoes and out of the dust, we're going to be specifically focusing on vocabulary and syntax. And in identifying irony in the big box, we will focus specifically on discourse. Okay, let's delve into stepping into a character's shoes in Out of the Dust, journaling using sensory imagery. Um, this lesson is part of a broader series of lessons that focus on taking the perspective of a main character as well as making her writing more descriptive. And in a previous lesson, I believe in the lesson previous to this, the tutor had delved into sensory imagery with her student. And so what you'll see in this plan is that she builds on some of those materials from that previous lesson to have her student write a journal entry from the perspective of this student, in which she describes what her experience is like in the Dust Bowl. You're going to see the materials here. We'll come back to the academic language section in a bit. Basically, in this lesson, she starts by referring to the novel and prompting her student to remember what's going on in the novel. And then she asks her student to read her own journal entry, and refers back to sensory word cards from the previous lesson as she does that. One of the things I really like about this lesson is how explicit the student is with regard to the purpose of the lesson. She tells her exactly what she's going to do today. She introduces a key vocabulary word in doing that, and she tells her what she's going to need to be able to do in order to successfully carry out this task. She also taps into the student's native language and using that as a resource with respect to a primary vocabulary word perspective in the lesson. In the modeling component, the tutor uses a main questionnaire, which is actually an odd phrasing for this, but it's basically a graphic organizer that takes the form of a questionnaire. And she uses that to help the student step into using first person and speaking from the character's perspective, as well as interpreting what the character whose perspective she's going to be writing from would think or say. And so she models how to fill this in as if she were a different character from the novel than the one that the student will have to delve into. And then there's a transition, and then in the student practice activity, she asks Maria to complete the main character questionnaire as if she were Billy Joe, a character from Out of the Dust. And then she invites Maria to write a journal entry using both the questionnaire and then also reminding her of sentence frames that she relates to or that she presents earlier from her own journal. And then at the end, we have a debriefing. So that gives you a sense of what the lesson entails. So let's start by identifying the academic language functions that this 209 tutor included in her lesson plan. Again, these functions are things that you want your students to do with language during the lesson. In this case, the tutor has said that she wants her student to interpret, actually I'm going to highlight these here, interpret and to describe. And so what we want to do is go up and make sure that these things are included in the purpose of the lesson. The tutor wrote, the purposes, pardon me, of this lesson are twofold. First, Maria will interpret the feelings of the character by stepping into her shoes and writing from her perspective. Second, she will use sensory language to describe the character's feelings and experiences. So that's one of the things you want to make sure. You want to make sure that your language, academic language functions are apparent in the purpose of your lesson. Okay, let's take a look at language demands. This tutor has included two language demands, vocabulary and syntax. I'll be honest with you, she could have also included discourse in this one, but I'm going to be showing you a different lesson plan in which discourse is a little bit more obvious. So let's talk about vocabulary in this lesson. The vocabulary that this tutor really believes that her student needs to know in order to interpret and describe are going to be first perspective, and you're going to see this down in the lesson plan, okay? Um, the tutor wants her student to take on the character's perspective, and she needs to do this in order to interpret what the character is thinking in the novel. So perspective is a key vocabulary word that she's going to need to know. Other vocabulary that her student needs to know were taught in the previous lesson, and these include sensory words. And so you can see that in the introduction to her lesson and in the journal entry that she creates and presents in the introduction to her lesson, that she's going to refer back to sensory word cards from that previous lesson. So think, feel, it could be taste, like if you taste the dust in your mouth. It could be, things that the student sees and descriptive words of things that the main character, Billy Joe, notices in the novel, that sort of thing. Now, syntax is another one, and you may not have thought of syntax when you looked at the purpose of the lesson, but because this tutor is asking her student to write from the perspective of Billy Joe, this is going to require that the student write in the first person. And because her student is an English language learner, that may not be entirely obvious to the student how to do that. So it's something that the tutor wants to make very explicit in her lesson. And you will see, for example, that in the instruction, and in this very clear statement in the introduction to her lesson to her student about what she's going to have to be able to do, she tells her that she's going to have to be able to write in the first person, I, as if you were Billy Joe. Okay? So syntax is a part of this. So let's talk about some of the academic language supports that this tutor has included in the lesson. Remember, the supports are things that you will do in the lesson to support your students in meeting the language demands, vocabulary, and syntax. Okay? These supports are also going to be evident in your procedures. I've already pointed out a few of them down here and highlighted them for you, but we'll explore the other ones in just a minute. So a primary academic language support that I think should be included in every single lesson or series of lessons is modeling, okay? So this tutor is modeling the journal entry, and she's modeling the use of the first person, okay? She's also presenting vocabulary such as sensory imagery on cards from the previous lesson, and she's discussing any new words prior to the reading of the journal. So this refers specifically to the word perspective. One of the things that she also does is she repeats key vocabulary, in particular the word perspective, throughout her lesson. Another academic language support is the graphic organizer or questionnaire, which is meant to support Maria's interpretations from the perspective of the character. She refers to her previous 5 senses plan, and she also talks about supporting the use of new vocabulary, again, perspective, and drawing on these resources as necessary. So you can see that this tutor has done a lot more than just modeling or showing visuals. she's included in detail what she plans on doing in this plan to support her students' ability to learn new vocabulary and engage in the necessary syntax in order to interpret and describe in this plan. Notice that for functions and for demands, it's okay to just include a couple words, interpret or describe, vocabulary and syntax. But one of the things that is important for you to do in supports is to really articulate in a little bit more detail, in a couple, maybe 3 sentences, exactly what you're going to do. And that's because when I'm reading your plan, I want to be able to, I guess, know what to anticipate within your procedures in terms of the kinds of supports that you are going to offer. This is a way of me, in a sense, being able to get inside your head and think about how you're thinking about your instruction and the kinds of supports that you're going to offer. Now, down in your procedures, your academic language supports should be in bold throughout your procedures. I've already highlighted some of these for you, but let's take a look at some of the others. When this tutor introduces the word perspective, she doesn't just say the word, she actually writes the word on a small whiteboard so it's visible to the student throughout the lesson. Other teachers might decide to put that on an anchor chart, right? And that's something that the student can refer back to. It could also go within the tutoring context, within the student's folder or journal or other materials that the student has access to. You'll also notice that when she introduces the word perspective, she also uses the student's native language by asking the student to consider if she's heard the word before or if she knows the word in Spanish. One thing I'd like to point out here is that this tutor did not include this up in the academic language supports. I think she just forgot to do that. So you don't see anything up here about using the student's native language. So that could have gone right there. In the modeling component of the lesson plan, the tutor explains what the questionnaire includes, and then she models how to fill in the questionnaire. And that modeling is really important. You're really just showing the student what you want him or her to be able to do. Importantly, she doesn't just show the student, but they actually have a conversation about the modeling and about how the tutor filled in the questionnaire. Within this conversation, the tutor emphasizes the sensory imagery and that I wrote it from Hachiko's perspective. So here she is using the vocabulary word, she's repeating the word perspective, and she's also using the first person I. And then after she does that, she actually highlights in that sample journal entry, she highlights or underlines sentence frames within the questionnaire. So for example, in her sample journal entry, she may have written, I felt distraught when the dust came into our house, or I am really worried about how my family is going to survive. And so when she highlights I feel or I think or I am worried about and makes that sample journal entry available to her student to refer back to, those serve as sentence structures that the student can use to support syntax and the kind of syntax that she wants her student to use. Okay, note in the transition, boy, that's an awfully short period of time in any lesson plan. A transition generally doesn't last very long, but it can still be an opportunity for supporting your student's academic language. So in this transition, the student writes, now I invite you to become Billy Joe and pretend you are in her shoes. Think about your background, actions, feelings, values, and write from her perspective. So you can see that she is repeating the vocabulary word perspective, and she's also pointing to the word on the whiteboard. Now we come to student practice, the main part of the activity. This would also be considered supported practice within the workshop model. So Maria is going to be completing the questionnaire. Um, Again, the student could have highlighted this because this is the graphic organizer, right? And that graphic organizer will then support Maria's ability to write the journal entry. The tutor invites Maria to write the journal entry, again repeating the vocabulary, from the perspective of the character. Before she has her begin writing, she prompts her to pre-plan and organize before writing, by jotting down some thinking, feeling, tasting, smelling, seeing words, again using the word cards from the previous lesson. She didn't articulate this, but I would ask the student to do this within the questionnaire or by taking the questionnaire, that graphic organizer, and then maybe highlighting some of the words in that questionnaire that are thinking, feeling, tasting, smelling, and seeing words. Also, as the student begins to write the journal entry, the tutor reminds her of the sentence frames. Again, those are sentence frames that the tutor highlighted back in her own example of the journal entry up in the introduction to the lesson. So you can see that there are also all kinds of academic language supports in this lesson. And you can see that the tutor has bolded them in the procedures, and we can go back and, for the most part, map them onto the kinds of things that, or onto the very specific things that she included in the academic language supports portion of the lesson plan. Next, we're going to go take a look at a lesson plan that focuses on teaching irony in 5th grade, and will focus on academic language discourse. Okay, this is the lesson plan for identifying irony in the picture book, The Big Box by Toni Morrison. This is a lesson plan that I co-taught with another teacher at Cedar Ridge Elementary School in Unit 5. She was a 5th grade teacher, and we planned it and co-taught it together. The idea with this lesson is to build on previous lessons that the teacher had taught her students regarding symbolism and other literary elements, to really help them identify irony. So one of the first things that I'd like to do is to flip down to the academic language section. So the first thing that you're going to see is that 2 academic language functions were identified in this lesson. First, the students will identify irony and explain how irony contributes to theme. And again, just like with the previous lesson plan, you'll go up to the purpose of the lesson and you're going to see those same verbs: identify and explain. Okay, so the purpose of this lesson is to teach students to identify irony in everyday photos and explain how irony contributes to the theme in a picture book. You're going to also, I didn't mention this with the previous plan, but in the Common Core state standards, you'll probably see similar verbs, but they may not be exactly the same verbs that you have identified in your plan. So here, this Common Core state standard says determine rather than identify. Okay. So the demands for this lesson include vocabulary, specifically the words irony and ironic, and discourse. And in this case, one of the things that I wanted students to be able to do was to provide warrants from the text when they explain how irony contributes to the theme. So let's jump into academic language supports. Okay, there are specific things that I planned to do in this lesson um, to support the students in understanding and using words, irony and ironic, and to be able to explain how irony contributes to the theme, in other words, discourse. So the first thing I did is I used lots of visuals. Okay, I showed visual images to illustrate irony. As I did this, I used language modeling and I repeated the key vocabulary. To support my students in the demand of discourse in order to explain how irony contributes to theme, I provided a T-chart and I engaged in language modeling of warrants from the text to support their discourse. All right. So, as with the previous lesson, academic language supports are included in bold in the lesson. So let's go through these procedures. As I introduced the lesson, I asked students if they'd ever heard the phrase, "That's ironic." That's actually a pretty common phrase that many kids in upper elementary school will be familiar with, although many won't. And so one of the first things I did is I talked about my own enjoyment of comic strips, and that one of the things that I think makes comic strips funny is that they're often ironic. And so I did this by showing them an example of a Far Side cartoon on a presentation. So I'm going to go really quickly to a Google slide presentation right here. And I'm going to take this to view it in presentation form. And I showed them this image right here. And this is a very ironic image, right? It's a very good illustration of irony. You have Midvale School for the Gifted, and it says pull, and the kid's pushing and pushing and can't get in. So let's go back to the lesson plan. So that's the first thing that I did. And then I actually used some language modeling. I said, yeah, it's ironic that he's going into the school for the gifted and he can't read the sign or doesn't think to, so he can't even get in. Then I introduce my plan and I tell, or the activity, I tell them that I want to help them learn how to identify irony and that we're going to start with some photos. So then we go into modeling. And I move on to the next slide. So I'm going to show you the other visuals that I have and how I think out loud about them. So I show the other slides, and I invite the students to articulate what makes them ironic. Okay. So let's go back to the presentation. Go back to view. Oh, come on. It's loading. Sorry. Okay, here we go. So here's the first one, irony. And you can see that it's a pickup truck with the flames right there. And so I asked the students to identify what's ironic. So here is a definition here as well, language or situations that seem to reverse normal expectations. Here's another example I asked the students to think about. Song lyrics. And at the time, Taylor Swift's Blank Space was pretty popular. So we talked about that one because, darling, I'm a nightmare dressed like a daydream. Another one. This one we spent quite some time talking about. Students talked about the irony of the world's highest standard of living in the Dust Bowl during, Dust Bowl, the Great Depression. Well, that was also during the Dust Bowl. And the comment, there's no way like the American way. And here you have these white people driving in a car, and the students noticed how almost everybody in the food line was Black. And so we talked about the irony of that. Okay, so going back to the lesson, um, we showed these other slides, and then after that, we went and we completed a T-chart on smart paper. You could also do this on a smart board with the expectation of the situation of what you might find on one side, and then the actual events or action on the other side. Okay. So most of these slides were funny, but it doesn't have to be funny. And so we talked about that with the final slide of the food line in front of the billboard. With each of these slides, we asked the students to talk about what is ironic in the picture, and that is bolded because I'm repeating the vocabulary, one of the target vocabulary words. And then we also asked the students to report out what they talked about, again, completing a T-chart. So as we had that conversation, I rephrased students' responses, so you get that repetition, again, repeating the words irony and ironic as necessary. We then transitioned to a read aloud, which had to do with fairness as well as freedom. So we showed the cover of the big box, introduced it, and then I did a read aloud. During the read aloud, and actually prior to the read aloud, I told the students that there were going to be some things that would seem unexpected or odd. So for example, at the beginning of the book, there's a phrase saying that the door that kids are in had 3 big locks. There was all this pretty stuff and the windows were wide, but it was kind of ironic because there were all of these nice things inside and had these wide windows. So I would have expected that the kids were going to be well treated, and I would expect the room to be bright with daylight. However, there were locks on the door. And then we continued reading, and we added to the T-chart that there was an expectation of real sky and open windows, but then the real events, it was just a picture with a fake sky, and that was kind of ironic. And we added those to the T-chart. Another example in the book was that there was a jar of genuine dirt. And I had asked students to see if they could find that example. All right. We later transitioned to assigning students partners and having them read the remainder of the text. And we asked them to create a T-chart in their notebooks, okay? That actually probably should have been bolded there, so I'm going to bold that. And then, so they ended up going through this activity themselves using the T-chart and referring back to the chart paper, anchor chart or the smart board in order to support their ability to describe and identify the irony and how it contributed to theme. So again, that T-chart was really providing support for the primary discourse that they needed to engage in. In the debriefing or closure to the lesson, we asked students to share their examples of irony that they found in the text. Okay, and again, they're referring to their own T-charts here. Boy, I'm finding a lot of places where I never actually bolded these things, but I'm doing it now. And then as they did this, we engaged in a discussion about the image of the box, some of the pictures in the novel. At the end of the lesson, we restated the meaning of irony and referred back to the examples that they found right there. And we used key terms again. Yeah, that's ironic because. Okay. And then we close the lesson by encouraging students to consider irony in their own writing and to notice examples. So again, this is, I'm going to highlight this one here too. This is, again, an example that really focuses both on vocabulary and discourse, and you can see all of the supports that were provided in the lesson in order to support the student's ability to engage in new vocabulary and appropriate discourse of literary analysis in order to explain and identify irony. I hope you found this presentation helpful. Another place that you can go to find some information regarding academic language is in the EdTPA Elementary Literacy Handbook. You'll find a glossary at the end of that handbook that has definitions of academic language, syntax, vocabulary, discourse, and some examples of those as well.